Hi, in this talk, I'll be telling you about how data science tools applied in tandem with high throughput experimentation can deliver both high performing polymeric vehicles as well as unambiguous design rules. Gene therapy has enormous therapeutic promise because it has the ability to cure diseases that were previously thought to be incurable. However, the widespread clinical adoption of gene therapy still faces steep financial barriers. This is because of the highly expensive nature of manufacturing and development processes associated with engineered viral vectors. If we can somehow replace viruses with a chemically defined synthetic substitute, then gene therapy can actually realize its therapeutic promises. Polymers are considered highly attractive alternatives to viral vectors because they are economical to manufacture and highly scalable. They must, however, contend with several intracellular and extracellular delivery barriers. In each step of this delicate delivery cascade, polymers have to protect their fragile therapeutic payloads and also prevent adverse immune responses. Optimizing polymer properties for this application is highly challenging because if you deviate even a little bit from the narrow window of what is optimal, it can result in catastrophic failure. Most people adopt a highly empirical approach to polymeric vector design. Here, you start with the hypothesis of what you think are the optimal properties for an efficient polymeric vector, and you go about synthesizing polymers with the desired combination of attributes such as monomers, architecture, microstructure, and so on. And this obviously results in a combinatorial explosion because of the sheer number of variables involved and can cause an extremely heavy experimental workload. Further, if your hypothesis is actually invalid, then you have to go back to the drawing board and start all over again, resulting in iterative cycles of design, build, and test. What I propose to do in my work is to increase the rate of discovery of polymeric vehicles by integrating statistical learning, high throughput experimentation, and combinatorial polymer design. In our approach, every experiment will be extremely valuable regardless of whether it results in a hit polymer or not. We start with a chemically diverse polymer library designed through combinatorial design, and after synthesizing these polymers, we ensure that the composition and molecular weight are what we want them to be. Then we formulate polyplexes with ribonucleoproteins, which are highly attractive payloads for gene editing, characterize the polyplexes, and deliver them to cells. After assessing editing efficiency using high throughput biological assays, we can identify hit polymers that will be taken forward for more rigorous validation studies. As for the rest of the library that was not a hit, they will still contribute to a highly interesting data set comprising both physicochemical characterization data as well as biological experimentation. So the data set derived from these high throughput studies will form the basis for our statistical learning efforts, which in turn will extract structure function relationships that draw quantitative maps between polymer attributes and biological outcomes. These will also lead to design rules that will inform the design of future polymer libraries wherein a greater number of hit polymers can be located. Our library comprises four cationic monomers of varying pKa values and three hydrophilic monomers of varying hydration behaviors. And we targeted copolymer compositions ranging from 0 to 100%. Using a parallel synthesizer, we were able to conduct up to 12 draft reactions at a go, which also ensured consistent mass and heat transfer condition for all our polymerization runs. Here I've shown you a snapshot of the characterization data for the DIP-HEMA subset of the library. You can see that we got all our target cationic compositions, and we also got pretty monodispersed polymer populations as shown in the SEC traces. We also determined the reactivity ratio of these two monomers to understand the polymer microstructure a little bit better. Importantly, we realized that the pK is actually a complex non-monotonic function of the polymer composition, and you have to individually estimate the pKa for each polymer in the library, and you should not be approximating it from the constituent cationic monomers. Um, Having obtained the polymers that we wanted, we proceeded to formulate polyplexes and deliver them to cells. Our cell line allowed for a fluorescence assay to measure CRISPR-Cas9 editing efficiencies. In this cell line, following the double-stranded break induced by the ribonucleic protein, you would have random insertions and deletions, and about one third of these frameshift mutations will contribute to mCherry expression in edited cells. A peculiarity of this particular cell line is that even if you have 100% editing efficiency, you only have 33% mCherry expression, which necessitates, an assay that combines sensitivity to low editing efficiency as well as throughput. We turned to imaging cytometry, through which we were able to process almost our entire library comprised of 86 formulations within the span of a single afternoon. Using imaging informatics pipelines, we were also able to pass through these large imaging data sets to obtain the proportion of mCherry positive cells for each treatment condition. In this talk, I'm just focusing on RNP delivery, but on my in my talk on Wednesday, I'll be discussing the co-delivery of plasmids with RNP to affect precise gene repair. Going back to the mCherry data, we were able to identify only one hit polymer, which is shown in red here. The rest of the library proved to be completely ineffectual in delivering RNPs. We also followed up our hit identification studies with validation measurements, wherein we used both flow cytometry and Sanger sequencing to establish the superiority of our hit polymer over four commercial transfection reagents. Having identified a hit polymer, our next question was, what is the physicochemical basis for the hit polymer's performance, and why did the rest of the library fail to deliver RNPs? We had three hypotheses that we had in mind. The first hypothesis was that maybe the binding affinity between the hit polymer and the RNP was just precisely engineered so that it could balance extracellular payload protection with intracellular payload release. So it's important that the polymer bind to the RNP strong enough that it can protect the RNPs from degradation outside the cell, but inside the cell it should be able to release the RNP so that it actually makes its way to the nucleus to initiate genome editing. So the Cas9 protein is sort of a patchwork of positive and negative charges, and the RNP is also got like a net negative charge. What we found interesting when we titrated in increasing amounts of our cationic polymer was that we did not observe uh, inversion of the charge. The magnitude of negative charge reduced somewhat, but we did not observe the formation of polyplexes with a net positive charge. When we performed gel electrophoresis assays, we kind of understood the reasons for the zeta potential data. We observed the presence of two kinds of RNPs in our polyplexes. The free RNPs actually migrated in response to the electric field, while the polymer bound RNPs stayed in the well. And so we thought, okay, maybe this is it. The hit polymer has intermediate binding affinity, and that's why it works so well. But sadly, when you look at the rest of the library, there are several instances of intermediate binding, and it rules out binding affinity as the source of the hit polymer's success. Next, we turn to this long-standing heuristic in the field, which says that, oh, if you engineer polymers with pK slightly below physiological pH, then you can balance extracellular stability with the ability to escape endosomes. This whole proton sponge hypothesis sort of favors polymers with pK values close to the physiological pH. Our hit polymer does have a pK close to this magic number of 7.4, but if you squint hard enough at this slide, you'll see that there are several other polymers that also have physiological pH pKs. So that again rules out the pK theory. And but something interesting we noticed during our PK measurements was that we noticed some pH dependent aggregation going on in some of our polymers. Here I've shown the hit polymer and two structural analogs. Here I've replaced the cationic moiety with instead of a tertiary amine, you have a primary amine. And here I keep the cationic moiety the same, but I replace the hema with this vitrionic MPC. So when you compare these three polymers during titration, we collected samples during the titration. We saw that for all three polymers below a pH of 6, the radius was well below 100 nanometers. But when you enter the neutral and basic regimes, the hit polymer underwent severe aggregation, whereas the other two polymers maintained their sizes. We understood that this was because the other two polymers maybe they remained fully solvated even after becoming deprotonated, whereas the hit polymer, once it goes from a semi-protonated state to a fully deprotonated state, it sort of collapses due to the formation of these hydrophobic aggregates. In order to understand this rapid hydrophobic collapse a little bit better, we turn to the Hill coefficient, which is basically a parameter that captures the degree of cooperativity during this deprotonation process. Here, theta is the deprotonation degree, and you can measure the Hill coefficient by looking at the slope of the Hill plot. The Hill plot basically asks the question: if you deprotonate one amine, does it make it more likely for neighboring tertiary amines to also deprotonate? Are deprotonation events independent, or are they somehow interlinked? So, if you look at the dip peg series of copolymers, you can see that the Hill plot varies quite a bit based on the copolymer composition. As you dial in more and more peg repeat units, your Hill coefficient decreases. Whereas for the dip hema family, you notice a consistently high Hill coefficient, suggesting that these polymers are so hydrophobic that they're going to cooperatively deprotonate irrespective of the composition. So while the correlation between Hill coefficient and hydrophobicity was quite informative, it still did not sufficiently explain why the hit polymer performed better than DIP 75, for instance, or DIP 25H25. So here I've tried to untangle the relationship between polymer attributes and biological performance using three separate hypotheses, and none of these hypotheses were very convincing. And this is because this problem cannot be analyzed in a univariate approach. Recognizing the complexity and multidimensionality of our dataset, we turn to a machine learning technique called random forest classifiers. Herein, you have an ensemble of decision trees where each decision tree only samples a small cross section of the data and a small cross section of the polymer features. And by randomizing the data and the polymer features across this large population of decision trees, you're ensuring that you get a representative picture of structure function relationships. While individual trees may not be, particularly informative, as an aggregate, they're highly accurate in describing the underlying physical behavior. Just to show you an example of what the decision tree looks like, you can see that at each level of the decision tree hierarchy, it asks a question that allows it to sort a given instance as toxic or non-toxic based on the polymer descriptors that it has been assigned. So some polymer features are more helpful in classification than others, and the classification questions we are looking at are high or low editing efficiency, toxic or less toxic, high or low RNP internalization, and more helpful features are assigned greater weights, which in turn helps us calculate the feature importance, which is plotted here in the form of a radar plot. When we ask the random forest models what are the most important polymer attributes for each biological metric, we got very divergent answers across these three. So for polymer uh, for polyplex uptake, for instance, you need to engineer electrostatic interactions such that your zeta potential and pK are sufficiently high. For cytotoxicity, we noticed that bulkier polyplexes mediated higher levels of toxicity. For editing efficiency, we found out that it was shaped by an interplay between polyplex size, hydrophobicity, and the Hill coefficient. And what we learned from our random forest models was that future polymers should incorporate cationic monomers that contain bulky alkyl substituents such that they can cooperatively deprotonate. And the second thing is you also want to boost your polymer hydrophobicity by avoiding highly hydrophilic monomers such as MPC. And yeah, so in summary, we were able to use combinatorial design to explore domains in chemical space that we normally would have ignored, and we synthesized polymers that we would have ordinarily not have paid attention to, and we were able to identify a hit polymer that sort of defies the traditional heuristics in polymeric gene delivery. Surprisingly, we noticed that cooperative deprotonation turned out to be a pretty interesting polymer attribute that should be considered in designing polymeric vehicles for RNP delivery. Finally, I want to emphasize that the relationship between uh, polymer design parameters and biological responses are highly complex, and this is not something you can do using traditional hypothesis testing, and you do need to engineer statistical learning approaches that can identify these structure function correlations. With that, I'd like to thank my advisor, my lab mates, and also the university imaging centers. I acknowledge funding sources, and I'd also like to thank the ACHE session organizers for the opportunity. Thanks for listening, and please do get in touch.